A bear surprises her on a calm morning, but something was off. Her instincts drove her to act quickly, but the discovery she made everything even more intriguing. The crisp autumn breeze rustled through the golden leaves surrounding Margaret Maggie Walker's mountain cabin near Aspen Ridge, Colorado. At 67, the retired widow had found solace in this secluded retreat after decades of teaching and raising her family. Her mornings usually followed a peaceful routine: hot tea, well-worn books, and contemplative walks through the dense forest that embraced her home like a protective cocoon. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. But this particular morning would shatter the tranquility she had come to cherish. As Maggie stood on her porch savoring the mountain air, an enormous bear emerged from the tree line. Her heart skipped a beat, but something in the animal's demeanor gave her pause. Instead of the aggressive stance she'd expect from a wild bear, this one appeared different, desperate almost. The bear's eyes locked with hers, its breathing heavy but not threatening. That's when Maggie noticed the electronic collar around its neck, a small red light blinking steadily. Her teacher's instinct kicked in. Something wasn't right. The bear's behavior suggested it wanted her to follow, but before she could process this unusual situation, mechanical sounds echoed through the nearby forest. Maggie retreated inside her cabin, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone to dial 911. The call wouldn't connect. She tried again, but the signal seemed completely blocked. Strange, she thought, considering she'd had reception just the day before. The bear remained at the edge of her porch, its eyes never leaving her. Against her better judgment, but driven by an inexplicable need to understand, Maggie grabbed her flashlight. "I must be losing my mind," she muttered to herself as she cautiously stepped outside. The bear immediately moved toward the tree line, looking back as if ensuring she would follow. Following a wild bear into the forest definitely wasn't part of her usual morning routine, but something about this situation demanded investigation. The mechanical sounds had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to envelope the forest. As they walked, Maggie noticed how the bear moved with purpose, leading her along a specific path. They reached a clearing where scattered papers caught the morning light. A partially burned backpack lay among them, its contents spilled across the forest floor. Maggie's heart raced as she examined the documents, aerial photos of the forest, strange graphs, and cryptic notes about animal monitoring. The sophisticated nature of the materials suggested this was no ordinary research project. Upon returning to her cabin, new fear gripped her heart. Fresh footprints marked the ground near her door. Someone had been there while she was gone. The implications sent a chill down her spine. Her peaceful mountain retreat had suddenly become the center of something much larger and more mysterious than she could have imagined. As she secured her door and windows, Maggie's mind raced with questions. Who would abandon research materials in such a manner? Why was the bear wearing an electronic collar? And most importantly, who had been at her cabin? The peaceful life she'd built in these mountains was about to change dramatically, and she had a feeling there was no going back. The rest of the day passed in tense anticipation. Maggie found herself jumping at every sound, peering through windows at the slightest movement outside. The bear had disappeared back into the forest, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. As evening approached, she organized the documents she'd found, trying to make sense of the technical jargon and mysterious notations. One phrase kept appearing in the margins: Project Echo. The more she read, the more convinced she became that these weren't ordinary research papers. Night fell, bringing with it an unsettling silence. Maggie sat in her favorite reading chair, but no book could hold her attention. Her mind kept returning to the bear's desperate eyes and those mechanical sounds in the forest. Little did she know, tomorrow would bring even more surprises, and the arrival of someone who would change everything. The next morning brought a knock at Maggie's door that would set in motion a chain of events she could never have anticipated. Standing on her porch was a group of researchers, led by a charismatic man who introduced himself as Dr. Peter Hale. His smile was perfect, too perfect, Maggie thought, as she listened to his explanation about conducting local wildlife studies. "Mrs. Walker," Dr. Hale said, his voice smooth as honey, "We're conducting essential research on the local fauna. We'd like your permission to install some equipment near your property." His team stood behind him, all wearing matching khaki uniforms with a subtle logo Maggie couldn't quite make out. Something about Dr. Hale's demeanor set off warning bells in Maggie's mind. Perhaps it was the way his eyes darted around her cabin, or how his smile never quite reached those eyes. Still, what reason did she have to refuse? "As long as you don't interfere with my daily routine," she found herself saying, even as her instincts screamed otherwise. Throughout the day, Maggie watched from her windows as the research team moved through the surrounding forest. Their movements seemed precise, calculated, more military than scientific. They carried sophisticated equipment she'd never seen before, and their conversations ceased whenever she came within earshot. As twilight approached, a new sound filled the air, the distinctive whir of drones. Maggie stood on her porch, watching lights dance between the trees in the distance. This wasn't normal wildlife research. Something else was happening in her beloved forest. That night she couldn't sleep. The drones continued their aerial dance, and occasionally she heard voices carried on the wind, too distant to make out words, but clear enough to know people were moving through the forest in the darkness. The bear returned briefly, appearing at the edge of the clearing. In the moonlight, Maggie noticed something clutched in its claws, a torn piece of fabric that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The next morning brought more surprises. While walking around her cabin, Maggie discovered fresh equipment she hadn't noticed before, small sophisticated devices partially hidden in the underbrush. They reminded her of the electronic collar on the bear, sharing the same sleek design and blinking lights. Dr. Hale's team returned mid-morning, their movements more urgent than the day before. "Everything going smoothly, Mrs. Walker?" Dr. Hale asked, but his tone suggested he wasn't really interested in her answer. His attention seemed focused on something in the distance beyond her cabin. As Maggie watched them work, she noticed how they kept checking their phones, which appeared to be receiving some kind of data. One researcher, younger than the others, repeatedly glanced her way with what looked like concern in his eyes. When their gazes met, he quickly looked away, but not before Maggie caught a glimpse of something that might have been guilt. The day progressed with an increasing sense of unease. More equipment appeared in the forest, and the drones became more frequent. Maggie began documenting everything in her teacher's notebook: times, locations, descriptions of the equipment. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing something far more significant than wildlife research. That evening, storm clouds gathered ominously over the mountains. The weather forecast hadn't mentioned rain, but nature had other plans. As the first drops fell, Maggie watched Dr. Hale's team hurriedly securing their equipment, their movements betraying an urgency that seemed out of proportion for a simple rainstorm. The downpour began in earnest, and with it came an isolation Maggie hadn't anticipated. The bridge connecting her cabin to the main trail collapsed under the torrential rain, effectively cutting off her escape route. As darkness fell, she stood at her window, watching the storm rage outside. The drones had disappeared, but somehow this didn't bring her any comfort. Lightning illuminated the sky, and in one brilliant flash, Maggie spotted something that made her blood run cold. A camera, perfectly concealed under her porch roof, pointed directly at her front door. How long had she been under surveillance? And more importantly, what had she unknowingly become part of? The discovery of the hidden camera changed everything. Maggie's hands trembled as she searched the exterior of her cabin, finding not one but several cameras strategically placed among the trees. Each device was masterfully camouflaged, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. The realization that she'd been watched, possibly for days, sent chills down her spine. Using her years of experience maintaining order in a classroom full of energetic students, Maggie forced herself to remain calm and think methodically. She carefully collected each camera she could find, storing them inside her cabin. The rain continued to pour outside, creating a natural white noise that masked any other sounds from the forest. As she examined the cameras more closely, she noticed they all bore the same sophisticated design as the bear's collar. The technology was far more advanced than anything she'd expect from typical wildlife researchers. These were military-grade surveillance devices designed for continuous monitoring and data transmission. The storm intensified throughout the night, bringing with it an oppressive darkness that seemed to press against her windows. Maggie found herself jumping at every crack of thunder, every flash of lightning. The isolation felt more acute now, with the bridge out and her phone still showing no signal. She was effectively cut off from the outside world. In the early hours of the morning, Maggie heard movement outside. Despite the ongoing storm, someone was out there. Through the rain-streaked windows, she caught glimpses of flashlight beams sweeping across her yard. They were looking for something. The missing cameras, she realized with a start. When dawn finally broke, Maggie ventured outside to inspect her surroundings. Fresh footprints in the mud confirmed her suspicions. Multiple people had been prowling around her cabin during the night. The tracks led in various directions, but all seemed to converge near where she'd found the first camera. The bear appeared again, this time moving with an urgency she hadn't seen before. It paced at the edge of the trees, occasionally looking back into the forest as if watching for something or someone. The red light on its collar blinked more rapidly now, creating an almost strobe-like effect in the morning mist. As Maggie watched the animal's behavior, a new sound cut through the post-storm silence, the distinct whir of helicopter blades in the distance. The bear's reaction was immediate. It disappeared into the forest, but not before giving Maggie one last meaningful look. She was beginning to understand that this creature was somehow connected to whatever mystery was unfolding in her mountains. Inside her cabin, Maggie began organizing everything she'd discovered so far: the burned backpack's contents, the mysterious documents, the surveillance cameras. Each piece seemed part of a larger puzzle. She spread the papers across her dining table, searching for patterns or clues she might have missed. One document particularly caught her attention: a map of the surrounding forest with specific locations marked in red. Several of these markers corresponded to areas where she'd noticed Dr. Hale's team setting up their equipment. But there was one location, marked with a different symbol, that lay deeper in the forest than any of the others. The sound of voices outside interrupted her investigation. Through her window, she saw two of Dr. Hale's researchers examining the ground where she'd found the cameras. Their conversation, though muffled, carried tones of concern and urgency. One of them spoke into a radio, gesturing frantically toward the tree line. Maggie's attention was drawn to movement at the forest's edge, but it wasn't the bear this time. A figure emerged from the trees, moving unsteadily as if injured. As the person drew closer, Maggie could see it was a young man, probably in his early 30s, wearing muddy hiking clothes. He clutched a notebook to his chest and kept looking over his shoulder as he approached her cabin. Something about his desperate expression made Maggie's teacher instincts kick in. This was someone in need of help. As she opened her door to the stranger, she had no way of knowing that this moment would mark the beginning of an even more extraordinary chapter in her mountain adventure. The young man's arrival would soon prove to be the key to unlocking the mysteries that had been building around her quiet mountain home. The young man introduced himself as Ethan Clark, his voice barely above a whisper as he glanced nervously at the windows. His clothes were torn and muddy, and exhaustion was etched deeply into his face. Maggie noticed he clutched a notebook filled with hastily scribbled notes and diagrams, similar to those she'd found in the burned backpack. "I was part of Dr. Hale's research team," Ethan explained, accepting the hot tea Maggie offered with trembling hands. "But what they're doing here, it's not what they claim. The wildlife research is just a cover." He paused, looking around anxiously before continuing. "I've been documenting everything, trying to gather evidence, but they discovered what I was doing." Maggie listened intently as Ethan described how he'd grown suspicious of the team's activities. The sophisticated equipment, the surveillance, the mysterious signals they were tracking. None of it aligned with standard wildlife research protocols. "The bear you've seen," he said, leaning forward, "it's not just being tracked. They've done something to it, something that's changed its behavior completely." As if on cue, a distant mechanical humming filled the air. Ethan's face paled. "They're using drones again. They're looking for me." He pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages of detailed notes and technical drawings. "Everything is connected. The electronic collars, the hidden cameras, the signal interference. They're testing something out here, something they don't want anyone to know about." Maggie showed him the documents she'd found in the burned backpack, and Ethan's eyes widened in recognition. "These were mine," he whispered. I had to abandon them when they started chasing me. I thought I'd destroyed everything." He pointed to the location marked on the map. "This is where it all centers. There's something there, something they're protecting with everything they have." The afternoon wore on as they compared notes and pieced together what they knew. Ethan explained how the team had been using the local wildlife, particularly the bear, as unwitting test subjects for their experiments. The electronic collars were more than simple tracking devices. They could influence the animal's behavior, guiding them to specific locations or making them perform certain actions. "But why?" Maggie asked, struggling to understand the purpose behind it all. What could be so important that they go to these lengths to keep it hidden? Before Ethan could answer, the distinct sound of helicopter blades cut through the air. They rushed to the window to see a sleek black helicopter emerging from the clouds, its searchlight cutting through the misty afternoon like a knife. The beam swept across the forest before focusing directly on Maggie's cabin. "We need to hide," Ethan said urgently, gathering his notebook. "They can't know I'm here." They quickly moved to the cabin's small cellar, closing the heavy wooden door just as the helicopter's downdraft rattled the windows above. For what seemed like hours, they sat in tense silence as the aircraft circled overhead, its searchlight periodically illuminating the cracks around the cellar door. When they finally emerged, the helicopter was gone, but fresh boot prints in the mud around the cabin told them they weren't alone. Near Maggie's garden, they discovered something that hadn't been there before: a metallic box partially buried in the soft earth. Inside, they found more documents, a strange electronic device that pulsed with a soft blue light and a rusty key. "This changes everything," Ethan muttered, examining the device. "This is one of their prototypes. It's not supposed to exist outside their secure facilities." He looked at Maggie with renewed urgency. "We need to document everything and find a way to expose what's happening here. But we have to be careful. These people will do anything to keep their secrets." As night fell, the bear returned once more, but something was wrong. It moved erratically, leaving a trail of blood drops on Maggie's porch before disappearing back into the darkness. Ethan's face grew grave as he examined the blood. "They're pushing too hard, too fast. The animals can't take this kind of manipulation forever." Looking out into the darkness, Maggie realized her peaceful mountain retreat had become ground zero for something far beyond her understanding. Whatever was happening in these mountains, she and Ethan might be the only ones who could bring it to light. But first, they needed to survive the night, and the helicopter's ominous appearance suggested that might not be as simple as it seemed. The early morning light filtered through the trees as Maggie and Ethan ventured into the forest, following the bear's blood trail. The air was thick with tension, every snapping twig and rustling leaf making them pause and listen. They had decided that waiting in the cabin was no longer an option. They needed answers. "Look at this," Ethan whispered, pointing to a tree they were passing. Carved into the bark was a symbol, the same one they had seen on the bear's electronic collar. The marking was precise, almost mechanical in its execution. "These aren't random," he explained. "They're waypoints. They're mapping something out here." As they moved deeper into the forest, they discovered more trees marked with the same symbol. The pattern seemed to lead them in a specific direction, corresponding with the location marked on the map from the burned backpack. The morning mist clung to the ground, creating an ethereal atmosphere that made every shadow seem alive with possibility. "Wait!" Maggie whispered suddenly, grabbing Ethan's arm. Ahead of them, partially hidden beneath a tangle of roots and fallen leaves, they spotted what appeared to be an entrance. The surrounding vegetation had been carefully arranged to conceal it from casual observation, but now that they knew what to look for, it was unmistakable. With cautious steps, they approached the hidden entrance. Years of teaching had taught Maggie to trust her instincts, and right now, every fiber of her being told her they were about to discover something significant. The entrance led to a crude tunnel, its walls reinforced with modern materials that seemed out of place in the natural setting. Inside, the tunnel opened into a larger space filled with abandoned electronic equipment. Screens lined one wall, their surfaces dark but somehow maintaining a sense of watchfulness. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting to sophisticated monitoring devices unlike anything Maggie had ever seen. "This is incredible," Ethan breathed, examining the equipment. For these are prototype monitoring systems. They're designed to track and influence animal behavior on a massive scale. He moved from one device to another, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. But this is way beyond anything they admitted to developing. Documents were scattered across makeshift desks, printouts, handwritten notes, and complex diagrams. Many bore the same symbol they'd seen on the trees and the bear's collar. Maggie began gathering the papers, her teacher's organizing instinct taking over. "We need to document everything," she said. "This is evidence of whatever they're trying to hide." Their investigation was interrupted by the sound of voices approaching from outside the tunnel. Muffled conversations grew clearer as footsteps drew near. Ethan and Maggie exchanged panicked looks before quickly searching for a hiding place among the equipment. Two armed men entered the underground facility, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. "Dr. Hale wants this place cleared out," one of them said. "Everything needs to be gone by tonight. He says the old lady is getting too curious." Maggie and Ethan hardly dared to breathe as the men moved through the space, checking equipment and gathering documents. From their hiding spot, Maggie could see more of the strange electronic devices being disconnected and packed away. Whatever operation had been running here, it was clearly being dismantled in a hurry. The men's voices grew distant as they moved deeper into the tunnel system, giving Maggie and Ethan a chance to slip away. Outside, the forest seemed different somehow, more threatening, as if the trees themselves were watching their every move. They needed to act fast before all evidence of what they'd discovered disappeared. "There's more to this tunnel system," Ethan whispered as they made their way back toward the cabin. "Those men mentioned other locations. Whatever they're doing, it's spread throughout these mountains." He pulled out his notebook, adding new notes to his already extensive documentation. As they walked, they discovered more electronic devices partially buried in the ground, each bearing the now familiar symbol. These devices formed a pattern, creating what appeared to be a grid throughout the forest. The technology was sophisticated enough to be nearly invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. The bear appeared again, watching them from a distance. Its behavior seemed more erratic than before, the electronic collar blinking rapidly. The animal's eyes held an almost human-like awareness that sent chills down Maggie's spine. Whatever experiments Dr. Hale's team was conducting, they were clearly affecting the local wildlife in ways that went far beyond simple tracking and monitoring. Back at the cabin, they began organizing their discoveries, but both knew they were running out of time. Dr. Hale's team was clearing out their operation, and soon all evidence would be gone. They needed to figure out what was really happening in these mountains, and they needed to do it before everything disappeared completely. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees as Maggie and Ethan strategized their next move. The discovery of the underground facility had confirmed their suspicions, but it had also raised countless new questions. The sophisticated equipment they'd found suggested an operation far more complex than simple wildlife research. "We need to understand what these devices are doing to the animals," Ethan said, spreading his notes across Maggie's kitchen table. His hands shook slightly as he pointed to detailed drawings of the electronic collars. "The technology they're using, it's not just tracking movement. They're somehow influencing behavior patterns, creating controlled responses." Maggie studied the diagrams, her years of teaching science helping her grasp the implications. The bear's behavior, it's not random, is it? They're using these devices to guide it, maybe even communicate through it. The thought sent a chill down her spine despite the warmth of her cabin. Their discussion was interrupted by a familiar sound, drones hovering nearby. Through the window, they could see at least 3 of them circling the area, their cameras clearly visible. One drone broke from the pattern, flying closer to the cabin than ever before. "They're not even trying to hide anymore," Ethan muttered, quickly gathering the papers. "They know we've seen too much." He paused, looking at Maggie with concern. "You know you can still walk away from this. Go back to town, forget what you've seen. They might leave you alone if you do." Maggie straightened her back, years of standing up to unruly students evident in her posture. "This is my home, my forest. If they're doing something that's hurting the wildlife here, I need to know why." Her voice carried the quiet authority that had commanded respect in countless classrooms. A sudden movement outside caught their attention. The bear had returned, but this time it wasn't alone. 2 more animals, each wearing similar electronic collars, emerged from the tree line. Their movements were synchronized in an unnaturally precise way, as if choreographed by an unseen hand. Ethan rushed to document the scene, his camera clicking rapidly. This is it. Proof that they're controlling multiple animals at once. The coordination, the synchronized movements. It's all being directed through those collars. As they watched, the bears began moving in a specific pattern, creating what appeared to be a perimeter around the cabin. The red lights on their collars blinked in perfect unison, creating an eerie light show in the gathering dusk. They're watching us through them, Maggie realized, her voice barely a whisper. The bears, the drones, the hidden cameras, it's all part of some kind of surveillance network. She moved to her bookshelf, pulling out her old teaching journals. We need to document everything, create a record they can't easily destroy. Working together, they began mapping out the locations of every device they'd found, every marked tree, every strange occurrence since this had all begun. Maggie's methodical teacher's approach, combined with Ethan's technical knowledge, created a detailed picture of what was happening in the forest. The electronic device they'd found in the metallic box began pulsing more rapidly, its blue light synchronized with the bear's collar lights. Ethan examined it carefully, his expression growing more concerned. This isn't just a prototype, it's a control node. They're using these to create some kind of network throughout the forest. As night fell, the drones remained, their lights now clearly visible against the darkening sky. The bears continued their patrol, their movements becoming increasingly mechanical. Whatever force was controlling them seemed to be growing stronger, more confident in its display of power. A new sound joined the symphony of surveillance, helicopter blades in the distance growing closer. Through the trees, they could see its searchlight sweeping the forest in a deliberate pattern. The bears immediately responded, their movements changing to match the helicopter's search grid. We need to move, Ethan said urgently, gathering their documentation. They're coordinating their search efforts. If we stay here, they'll trap us. He looked at the bears outside, their eyes reflecting an unnatural intelligence. We need to find what's at the center of all this, the source controlling everything. Maggie nodded, quickly packing a small bag with essentials. After decades of teaching, she'd learned to trust her instincts when something wasn't right, and everything about this situation was screaming danger. As they prepared to leave, she took one last look at her beloved cabin, wondering if she'd ever see it the same way again. The forest at night was a different world entirely. Maggie and Ethan moved carefully through the darkness, guided only by the dim light of the stars filtering through the canopy above. The helicopter's searchlight created shifting shadows that made navigation even more challenging, but they pressed on, following the pattern of marked trees they'd discovered earlier. The signal from these devices gets stronger as we move east, Ethan whispered, consulting a small electronic meter he'd brought from the underground facility. The device's display pulsed with increasing frequency as they progressed deeper into the forest. Whatever's controlling the animals, it's somewhere in this direction. They paused briefly behind a large oak tree as the helicopter passed overhead. The searchlight swept past their position, and in its brief illumination they spotted something they hadn't noticed before, a series of small metallic objects embedded in the ground, forming a line that disappeared into the darkness. More monitoring equipment, Ethan explained, examining one of the devices. They've created an entire grid system throughout these mountains. The animals, the drones, even the signal interference, it's all connected through this network. Maggie's teacher instincts kicked in as she began to see the pattern. They're not just monitoring the forest, she realized. They're trying to control it. Every piece of equipment, every marked tree, it's all part of something bigger. She pulled out her notebook, quickly sketching the layout of the devices they'd found. Their progress was suddenly interrupted by movement ahead. The bears had reappeared, their electronic collars blinking in that unnaturally synchronized pattern. But this time something was different. The animals moved with an almost mechanical precision, forming a barrier between them and their intended direction. They're herding us, Ethan whispered urgently. The bears aren't acting on instinct anymore. Someone's controlling their movements directly. He checked his meter again, its display now showing intense activity. The signal's getting stronger. We must be getting close to something important. Using her years of experience observing behavior patterns in her classroom, Maggie noticed something subtle about the bears' movements. Look at their eyes, she whispered. They're fighting whatever's controlling them. The natural instinct is still there, struggling against the artificial commands. A sudden burst of static from one of the nearby monitoring devices made them freeze. Through the interference, they could make out fragments of radio communications. Dr. Hale's voice giving orders to his team. "Secure the perimeter. Can't let them reach." Primary Control Center. The bears' behavior became more erratic, their movements less coordinated, as if the control signal was fluctuating. Taking advantage of this moment of confusion, Maggie and Ethan slipped past them, moving deeper into the forest. The electronic meter's readings grew stronger with each step, leading them toward whatever secret lay hidden in these mountains. They discovered more trees marked with the mysterious symbol, their spacing becoming more frequent. The ground beneath their feet changed too, revealing hints of artificial structures hidden beneath the forest floor. Small ventilation pipes, cleverly disguised as natural features, emerged from the earth at regular intervals. The helicopter's searchlight suddenly illuminated a clearing ahead, revealing a sight that made them both gasp. Hidden beneath a canopy of carefully maintained foliage was what appeared to be some kind of command center. Solar panels disguised as rock formations powered an array of sophisticated equipment. Antennas and satellite dishes, painted to match the surrounding vegetation, pointed skyward. "This is it," Ethan breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and amazement. "This is where they're controlling everything from. The animals, the surveillance network, all of it." He began documenting everything with his camera, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. Maggie watched the facility with growing concern. The level of sophistication, the careful concealment, the sheer scale of the operation, it all pointed to something far beyond simple wildlife research. What could be so important that it required this level of control over an entire ecosystem? As they crouched in the darkness, planning their next move, the bears appeared again. This time, they formed a perfect circle around the facility, their collars blinking in perfect synchronization with the equipment's lights. The message was clear. They had found what they were looking for, but getting closer would not be easy. The command center loomed before them, a testament to technological sophistication hidden in nature's embrace. Maggie and Ethan observed from their concealed position as teams of researchers moved purposefully around the facility, their activities illuminated by carefully hidden LED floodlights that mimicked natural moonlight. "Look at how they've integrated everything into the landscape," Ethan whispered, pointing to various camouflaged components. "Those rock formations? They're actually cooling units, and those fallen logs, signal repeaters. They've turned this entire section of forest into one massive control system." Maggie watched a group of researchers huddle around a central console, their faces illuminated by multiple screens displaying what appeared to be real-time data from throughout the forest. Her trained eye noticed patterns in their behavior, the urgent whispers, the frequent glances toward the forest, the nervous energy that suggested something wasn't going according to plan. "The bears are still maintaining their perimeter," she observed, noting how the animals moved with clockwork precision. "But look at their movements. They're becoming more erratic, less coordinated. Whatever system they're using to control them seems to be struggling." Ethan consulted his electronic meter, which now displayed readings off the scale. "The signal strength here is incredible. They must be using some kind of new technology to maintain control over such a large area." He carefully documented everything with his camera, making sure to capture the sophisticated integration of technology with the natural environment. Their observations were interrupted by a sudden commotion at the facility's entrance. Dr. Hale emerged from within, his usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Find them," they heard him command. "They've seen too much. We can't risk them exposing the project before we're ready." The bears' behavior changed instantly, their movements becoming more aggressive as new commands were input into the control system. The electronic collars pulsed with increased intensity, casting an eerie red glow through the undergrowth. "They're pushing the system too hard," Ethan muttered, concern evident in his voice. "The animals can't handle this level of control indefinitely. It's going to backfire." As if confirming his words, one of the bears suddenly stopped, shaking its head violently, as if trying to break free from an invisible grip. Maggie's attention was drawn to a series of large cables running from the facility into the ground. "These must connect to those devices we found in the forest," she reasoned. They're creating some kind of network, but for what purpose? What could be so important that they'd go to these lengths? A researcher emerged from the facility carrying what appeared to be a newer version of the electronic collar they'd seen on the bears. The device was somehow different, more sophisticated, with additional components that glowed with an intense blue light. Doctor Hale took the device, examining it with an expression that made Maggie's blood run cold. "We have to perfect the system," they heard him say. "The investors are getting impatient. If we can demonstrate full control over the local wildlife, the military applications alone would be worth billions." His words confirmed their worst fears about the true nature of the project. Ethan began frantically documenting everything in his notebook. "This goes way beyond simple research," he whispered. "They're developing a way to control any animal, to turn them into living surveillance systems, maybe even weapons. The implications are staggering." As they watched, more researchers emerged from the facility carrying equipment, servers, control panels, and what appeared to be prototype versions of the same technology they'd seen throughout the forest. They were clearly preparing to move the operation, perhaps warned by the discovery of their underground facility. The bears' behavior continued to deteriorate, their movements becoming increasingly unpredictable. The control system was clearly straining to maintain its grip on the animals, the electronic collars blinking erratically as natural instincts fought against artificial commands. Maggie's years of teaching had taught her to recognize when a situation was about to spiral out of control. "We need to find a way to shut this down," she whispered to Ethan. "Not just document it, stop it. These animals are suffering, and who knows what they plan to do with this technology once it's perfected." As if in response to her words, the facility's lights flickered, and for a brief moment the bears froze in place. Something was interfering with the control system, creating an opportunity they hadn't expected, but taking advantage of it would mean exposing themselves to Dr. Hale and his team, a risk that could change everything. The fluctuation in the facility's power system created a moment of chaos that Maggie and Ethan couldn't ignore. The bears' electronic collars flickered erratically, their synchronized movements falling into disarray as the control system struggled to maintain its grip. Inside the facility, alarms began to sound, their muffled warnings echoing through the forest. "Something's interfering with their main control system," Ethan whispered, his eyes fixed on the electronic meter whose readings now jumped wildly. "The signal's becoming unstable." He quickly documented the changing readings, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the tension. Maggie watched as Dr. Hale's team scrambled to respond to the crisis. Years of handling classroom emergencies had taught her to read panic in people's movements, and right now, every gesture she observed spoke of barely contained fear. The researchers rushed between control panels, their earlier confidence replaced by growing desperation. "Look at the bears," she murmured, pointing to where the animals had begun to move more naturally, shaking their heads as if awakening from a deep sleep. The electronic collars continued to pulse, but their lights now flickered independently rather than in their previous eerie synchronization. Through the facility's windows, they could see Dr. Hale gesturing frantically at a bank of monitors. "Stabilize the network," his voice carried through the chaos. "We can't lose control now. Everything we've worked for depends on maintaining the link." Ethan's attention was drawn to a series of satellite dishes, partially hidden among the trees. "Those must be part of their backup system," he said, quickly sketching their layout in his notebook. "But something's causing interference. Maybe the storm damaged some of their equipment." The facility's lights flickered again, and this time, several of the bears began moving away from their assigned positions. The natural instincts of the animals were clearly reasserting themselves as the control system's influence weakened. Dr. Hale's voice grew more urgent as he barked orders to his team. "Transfer all power to the primary control node. We can't risk losing the entire network." His commands were followed by a surge of activity as researchers rushed to comply, their movements becoming increasingly frantic. Maggie's teacher instincts told her this was a crucial moment. "They're losing control," she whispered. "Not just of the bears, but of their entire operation." She carefully documented the scene in her notebook, her neat handwriting capturing every detail despite the growing chaos. A loud humming filled the air as backup generators kicked in, their sound poorly masked by the facility's camouflage. The bears reacted to the noise, several of them now moving with clear signs of agitation. The electronic collars continued their erratic behavior, their lights pulsing in random patterns. "The interference is getting stronger," Ethan observed, checking his readings. "Whatever they're using to control the animals, it wasn't designed to handle this kind of disruption." He pointed to where several of the camouflaged monitoring devices had begun emitting visible sparks. Through the windows, they could see researchers rushing to secure equipment and data. Screens displayed error messages and warning signals, their red glow reflecting off the worried faces of the technical team. Dr. Hale moved from station to station, his earlier composure completely shattered. "Begin emergency protocols," he ordered. "Transfer all critical data to secure storage. We need to protect the core research at all costs." His words were punctuated by another power fluctuation, this one stronger than the previous ones. The bears were now moving with increasing independence, their actions showing clear signs of natural behavior returning. The electronic collars continued to flash, but their influence over the animals appeared to be waning. One particularly large bear approached the facility's perimeter, its movements suggesting growing awareness of its surroundings. "They're going to lose everything," Ethan whispered, his voice a mixture of concern and hope. The system wasn't designed for long-term control. The animal's natural instincts are too strong to suppress indefinitely. Maggie watched as more equipment began to malfunction, creating a cascade of failures throughout the facility. Her years of teaching had shown her that sometimes the most important lessons came from watching systems fall apart. And right now she was witnessing the collapse of something that never should have existed in the first place. The chaos at the facility reached a fever pitch as systems continued to fail. Maggie and Ethan remained hidden in their vantage point, documenting everything as Dr. Hale's carefully constructed operation began to crumble. The sophisticated camouflage that had kept the facility hidden now worked against them, trapping heat from malfunctioning equipment beneath its artificial canopy. "They're losing control of everything," Ethan observed, his electronic meter now showing wildly fluctuating readings. "The network is collapsing." He carefully photographed the scene as researchers rushed between workstations, their movements becoming increasingly desperate as more systems failed. The bears, now almost completely free from the control system's influence, began exhibiting natural behavior patterns. Maggie watched as they moved away from their assigned positions, their electronic collars still attached, but no longer controlling their actions. Her teacher's analytical mind noted how quickly nature reasserted itself once artificial constraints were removed. Inside the facility, Dr. Hale's voice had lost its usual smooth confidence. "Secure all research data," he commanded, his tone edged with panic. "We can't lose years of development." Researchers scrambled to comply, downloading data and disconnecting equipment as alerts continued to sound throughout the complex. The large bear they'd been watching approached the facility's perimeter fence, its movements now completely natural. The electronic collar around its neck sparked occasionally, but appeared to have lost all control over the animal. Other bears followed its lead, their instincts guiding them away from the artificial environment that had held them captive. "Look at this," Ethan whispered, pointing to his notebook where he'd been tracking the signal patterns. "The interference isn't random. Something in the forest is actively disrupting their control system." He showed Maggie a series of wave patterns he'd documented, each showing increasing levels of disruption. Through the facility's windows, they could see monitors displaying error messages across their screens. The sophisticated tracking system that had monitored every movement in the forest was now failing, its displays showing static instead of the usual detailed data feeds. Dr. Hale moved frantically between control stations, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of control. "Transfer everything to the backup servers," he ordered, but his command was met with more bad news from his team. The backup systems were offline, affected by the same mysterious interference that had disrupted the main network. The technology that had seemed so powerful and controlling was now revealing its vulnerabilities. Maggie's attention was drawn to movement at the facility's entrance. Teams of researchers began emerging, with arms full of equipment and documents, loading everything into waiting vehicles. The evacuation appeared hastily planned, with people arguing over what to save and what to leave behind. "They're abandoning the facility," Maggie whispered, her years of experience helping her read the situation. but they'll try to preserve as much of their research as possible. She carefully documented the types of equipment being removed, noting how certain pieces seemed to take priority over others. The bears continued their liberation, moving with increasing confidence as they broke free from the last remnants of artificial control. The electronic collars that had once directed their every move now hung uselessly around their necks, their lights flickering weakly before going dark. Ethan focused his camera on Dr. Hale, who now stood in the facility's doorway, watching his project collapse around him. The man's usual self-assured demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by a mixture of anger and defeat. He barked orders into a satellite phone, his gestures becoming more agitated with each passing moment. "We need to document everything before they completely clear out," Ethan said, his voice urgent but controlled. "This might be our only chance to prove what they were doing here." He continued photographing the scene, capturing every detail of the facility's hasty evacuation. Maggie noticed something that made her grab Ethan's arm. "The bears," she whispered. "They're all moving in the same direction." Indeed, every freed bear was heading toward a specific point in the forest, guided by something other than the now failed control system. Their movement seemed purposeful, almost as if they were being called by something hidden deeper in the mountains. The evacuation of the facility continued in barely controlled chaos, as Maggie and Ethan followed the bears' purposeful movement through the forest. The animals, now free from artificial control, seemed drawn to something beyond human technology's reach. Their path led deeper into the mountains, away from the failing control center. "The bears know something we don't," Maggie whispered, her teacher's intuition picking up on subtle patterns in their behavior. The animals moved with increasing confidence, their electronic collars now nothing more than useless accessories around their necks. The natural world was reasserting itself, and these creatures were responding to its call. Ethan consulted his electronic meter, which displayed unusual readings. "The interference is stronger in the direction they're heading," he noted, documenting the changing signal patterns. "Whatever disrupted the control system seems to be coming from somewhere ahead." Behind them, the sounds of the facility's evacuation grew more urgent. They could hear Dr. Hale's voice carrying through the trees, ordering his team to salvage what they could. The careful camouflage that had hidden their operation was being stripped away in their haste to escape. "We need to follow the bears," Maggie decided, her voice firm with conviction. "They're leading us to something important." Years of observing behavior patterns in her classroom had taught her to trust when something significant was unfolding. As they moved deeper into the forest, they discovered more electronic devices partially buried in the ground. These machines, once part of the control network, now sparked and sputtered uselessly. Nature seemed to be systematically dismantling the artificial system that had been imposed upon it. The bears led them to a clearing they hadn't seen before. At its center stood an ancient tree, its massive trunk bearing the scars of countless seasons. What caught their attention, however, was what surrounded it. Dozens of the same electronic monitoring devices they'd seen throughout the forest, all gathered here as if drawn by an unseen force. "Look at this," Ethan breathed, examining one of the devices. "They're all active, but they're not responding to the facility's commands anymore. It's like they've been reprogrammed by something else." He carefully photographed the scene, his camera capturing the strange confluence of technology and nature. Maggie approached the ancient tree, noticing something unusual about its bark. Embedded within the natural grooves and patterns were what appeared to be crystalline formations, barely visible unless you knew where to look. These formations pulsed with a subtle energy that seemed to resonate with the surrounding forest. "The tree," she realized, her voice filled with wonder. "It's not just a tree. Those crystals, they must be what's causing the interference." Her scientific mind raced to understand the implications. Nature had provided its own defense against the artificial control system, using materials and forces that Dr. Hale's team hadn't anticipated. The bears gathered around the tree, their behavior now completely natural and at ease. The electronic collars around their necks had gone completely dark, overcome by whatever force emanated from the crystalline formations. The animals showed no signs of the mechanical behavior that had characterized them under the control system's influence. Ethan's electronic meter began displaying unprecedented readings near the tree. "The energy signature here is like nothing I've ever seen," he said, quickly noting the measurements in his notebook. "It's as if the tree is generating some kind of natural electromagnetic field that disrupted their entire network." Through the trees, they could still see the lights of vehicles as Dr. Hale's team continued their hasty evacuation. The facility that had once seemed so powerful and controlling now stood partially dismantled, its technology rendered useless by forces its creators hadn't understood. "They tried to control nature," Maggie said softly, watching the bears move peacefully around the ancient tree. "But they never realized that nature had its own ways of protecting itself. Her years of teaching science had shown her that the natural world often held solutions that technology couldn't match." The crystals in the tree pulsed with increasing intensity, their energy spreading through the forest like ripples in a pond. Each pulse seemed to strengthen the natural order, pushing back against the artificial controls that had been imposed upon the wilderness. The ancient tree stood like a sentinel in the clearing, its crystalline formations pulsing with an energy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Maggie and Ethan watched in amazement as more of Dr. Hale's electronic devices began failing, drawn to the tree's location only to be rendered powerless by its natural force field. "The whole forest is connected through these crystals," Ethan realized, carefully documenting the phenomenon. His electronic meter's readings continued to show unprecedented patterns. They form some kind of natural network that's been here long before Dr. Hale's team arrived. He sketched the crystal formations in his notebook, noting their unusual structure and arrangement. Maggie's attention was drawn to the bears, who had settled peacefully around the tree. Their behavior showed no signs of the artificial control that had dominated them earlier. The electronic collars, now completely defunct, hung loosely around their necks like abandoned jewelry. "Nature found a way to protect itself," she observed, her teacher's mind making connections. "These crystals must have been interfering with their control system from the beginning. That's why they had to keep adjusting and upgrading their technology." She approached the tree carefully, noting how the crystals seemed to respond to her presence with subtle pulses of light. Through the trees, they could hear the continued chaos of the facility's evacuation. Dr. Hale's voice carried on the wind, becoming increasingly frustrated as more systems failed. The sound of helicopter blades indicated that larger equipment was being airlifted out, the operation now fully in retreat. Ethan moved closer to examine one of the fallen monitoring devices. "Look at this," he said, pointing to its internal components. "The crystals aren't just blocking their signals, they're actually reprogramming the equipment somehow. It's like the forest is absorbing their technology and turning it against them." The bears suddenly became alert, their attention focused on something approaching through the trees. Maggie and Ethan tensed, but the animals showed no signs of aggression. Instead, they seemed to be awaiting something, their behavior suggesting anticipation rather than fear. From the shadows emerged more wildlife, deer, foxes, even birds, all wearing various versions of Dr. Hale's monitoring devices. The animals gathered around the ancient tree, drawn to its protective influence. As they approached, their electronic attachments began failing one by one, the controlling technology no match for the natural force emanating from the crystals. "It's like a sanctuary," Maggie whispered, watching the gathering of wildlife. The animals found a way to break free from the artificial control by following some natural instinct we don't understand. Her years of studying science had taught her that nature often held secrets that defied human comprehension. The crystalline formations pulsed more strongly, their light creating patterns that seemed to dance through the forest canopy. Each pulse appeared to strengthen the natural order, pushing back against the artificial systems that had tried to dominate it. The animals responded to this energy, their movements becoming more natural and fluid with each passing moment. Through a gap in the trees, they could see teams of researchers hastily loading the last of their equipment into vehicles. The facility that had once seemed so imposing now stood partially dismantled, its powerful technology rendered useless by the forest's natural defenses. "We need to document everything," Ethan said urgently, his camera clicking rapidly. "The way the crystals interact with their technology, how the animals responded to the tree's energy. It's all evidence of something extraordinary." He worked quickly, knowing they might never have another chance to record these events. Maggie moved carefully among the gathered animals, her scientific curiosity overcoming her caution. The wildlife showed no fear of her presence, seemingly aware that she posed no threat to their newfound freedom. She noticed that some of the younger animals had never known a life without electronic control, yet they too responded instinctively to the tree's natural energy. The sound of the helicopter grew closer, its searchlight cutting through the canopy as it made another pass over the area. But here, in the shelter of the ancient tree, its artificial light seemed weak and ineffective against the natural radiance of the crystals. The forest had created its own defense system, one that no human technology could overcome. The helicopter's searchlight swept through the forest with increasing urgency as Dr. Hale's team rushed to salvage what remained of their operation. From their position near the ancient tree, Maggie and Ethan could see the facility's lights flickering one last time before going completely dark. The natural force emanating from the crystals had grown too strong for any artificial system to resist. "They're not just evacuating," Ethan observed, checking his readings. "They're running away from something they don't understand." His electronic meter continued to show extraordinary patterns as the crystal formations pulsed with steady rhythm. The forest is actually getting stronger as their technology fails. Maggie watched as more animals arrived at the clearing, each bearing some form of Dr. Hale's monitoring equipment. The devices, once symbols of human control over nature, now hung uselessly from their bearers. The crystalline energy seemed to welcome each new arrival, its pulses growing more vibrant with every liberation. "It's like the whole forest is awakening," she said softly, her teacher's mind trying to comprehend the scale of what they were witnessing. The natural world had not only rejected the artificial control system, but was actively dismantling it, using forces that defied conventional scientific understanding. Through the trees, they could hear Dr. Hale's increasingly desperate commands. "Secure everything! We can't leave any trace of the project." His voice carried notes of frustration and fear as more of his carefully planned systems crumbled under the forest's natural defense. Ethan continued documenting everything, his camera capturing the extraordinary scene. "The crystals aren't just affecting their equipment," he explained, reviewing his photographs. "They're creating some kind of natural communication network throughout the forest. That's how the animals knew where to find this place." The bears that had first led them to this discovery now moved with complete freedom, their natural instincts fully restored. The electronic collars that had once controlled their every move lay scattered around the clearing, their lights permanently extinguished by the crystal's energy. Maggie approached one of the fallen devices, examining it with scientific curiosity. "Look at how the internal circuits have been completely transformed," she noted. "The crystals didn't just disable their technology, they changed it into something else entirely. The device's components had been altered at a fundamental level, twisted into patterns that mimicked the natural crystalline structures." The helicopter made another pass overhead, but its searchlight seemed weak and ineffective against the natural radiance now emanating from the forest. The ancient tree stood as a beacon of natural order, its crystal formations pulsing with an energy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. "We need to get back to my cabin," Maggie said suddenly, remembering something crucial. "All the evidence we collected, the documentation, we can't let them find it." She knew that Dr. Hale's team would try to erase all traces of their failed experiment, including any evidence she and Ethan had gathered. As they prepared to leave the clearing, they noticed the animals had begun moving in a new pattern. The wildlife formed a protective circle around the ancient tree, their behavior suggesting an instinctive understanding of its importance. Nature had not only defended itself, but had established a new order in the wake of the failed human intervention. The sound of vehicles starting up echoed through the forest as Dr. Hale's team began their final retreat. The facility that had once dominated this section of wilderness now stood abandoned, its powerful technology rendered obsolete by forces its creators had never anticipated. Ethan made one final set of measurements before they left the clearing. "The crystal's energy signature is still growing stronger," he reported, his voice filled with wonder. "It's as if the forest is building up some kind of natural immunity against artificial control." As they made their way back toward Maggie's cabin, they could see the last of Dr. Hale's vehicles leaving the area. The elaborate operation that had sought to control nature had been thoroughly defeated by the very forces it had tried to dominate. The journey back to Maggie's cabin took on new urgency as they heard more vehicles leaving the facility. The forest around them had changed, not physically, but there was a palpable difference in its energy. The natural world seemed more alive, more aware, as if awakened by its victory over artificial control. "Something's wrong," Ethan said suddenly, his pace quickening. Through the trees, they could see an orange glow coming from the direction of Maggie's cabin. As they got closer, their worst fears were confirmed. The cabin had been completely ransacked, and someone had attempted to destroy any evidence they might have left behind. "All our documentation," Maggie whispered, her heart sinking as she surveyed the damage. Years of teaching had taught her the importance of preserving evidence, but now everything they'd collected seemed lost. The careful notes, the photographs, all the proof of what had happened in these mountains, gone. But then something caught her eye. Near her garden, partially hidden beneath disturbed soil, was a metallic glint. "Look," she said, carefully brushing away the dirt. It was the metal box they'd found earlier, and inside they discovered their most crucial evidence had survived. The strange electronic device, documents, and the rusty key. They were too rushed to do a thorough job, Ethan observed, checking the device which still pulsed with its mysterious blue light. "And look, the energy from the crystal tree seems to have affected this too." The device's display now showed patterns similar to those they'd seen in the clearing. A familiar sound drew their attention. The bear they'd first encountered had returned, but this time it moved with natural grace, the electronic collar around its neck now completely dark. The animal regarded them with clear, intelligent eyes before moving toward the edge of the property. "It wants us to follow again," Maggie realized. Despite everything that had happened, the connection they'd formed with this creature remained. The bear led them to a new discovery, a hidden clearing they hadn't noticed before, where they found one last active device still emitting signals. "This must be a backup system," Ethan said, examining the device. "But look, it's being transformed by the same crystal energy we saw at the tree." The machine's lights pulsed in sync with the distant crystal formations, its purpose somehow altered by the forest's natural power. They could hear the helicopter making one final pass overhead, its searchlight sweeping the area one last time. But here, among the trees, they felt protected. The forest had become their ally, its newly awakened energy providing a shield against those who would try to control it. "We need to make sure this story gets told," Maggie said firmly, her teacher's determination shining through. "Not just for us, but for the forest, for the animals, for everyone who needs to understand that nature can't be controlled and exploited." Ethan nodded, already documenting the transformed device with his camera. "The crystal's energy is spreading," he observed. "Look how it's affecting all their remaining technology. It's like the forest is creating its own network, but one that works in harmony with nature instead of trying to control it." As night fell, they could see the last lights of Dr. Hale's operation disappearing into the distance. The facility that had once threatened to dominate these mountains now stood empty, its powerful technology defeated by forces its creators had never understood. The bear watched them from the tree line, its presence a reminder of everything they'd witnessed. The electronic collar that had once controlled it now served as a symbol of nature's resistance to artificial control. Around them, the forest hummed with its newfound energy, the crystal's influence continuing to spread through the natural world. "Tomorrow we'll need to find a way to share what we've learned," Maggie said, her voice filled with purpose. "But tonight, I think we're exactly where we need to be." She looked around at her beloved forest, now transformed but somehow more real, more alive than ever before. The first rays of dawn brought a new sense of purpose to Maggie's mountain home. The forest had transformed overnight, its natural rhythms restored and strengthened by the crystal's energy. Where Dr. Hale's equipment had once dominated the landscape, nature was already beginning to reclaim its territory. "The transformation is still spreading," Ethan observed, consulting his electronic meter. The device now showed patterns he'd never seen before, influenced by the same crystal energy that had defeated Dr. Hale's control system. "It's like the forest has created its own immune system against artificial interference." Maggie walked through her garden, noting how even the plants seemed more vibrant. Her years as a science teacher had taught her to observe natural phenomena carefully, and what she saw now defied conventional explanation. The crystal's influence had enhanced rather than disrupted the natural order. "Look at this," she called to Ethan, pointing to where several of Dr. Hale's abandoned monitoring devices lay partially buried. The equipment had been transformed, its electronic components twisted into patterns that mimicked the natural crystal formations. The forest isn't just disabling their technology, it's repurposing it. The bear appeared again at the edge of the clearing, now accompanied by several other animals. All of them still wore the defunct electronic collars, but their behavior was completely natural, showing no traces of the artificial control that had once dominated them. They moved with confidence and purpose, fully reconnected with their natural instincts. "We need to organize all our evidence," Ethan said, carefully laying out what they'd managed to save from the cabin. The metal box they'd recovered contained crucial documentation, proof of what Dr. Hale's team had attempted and how nature had responded. People need to understand what happened here. As they worked, more signs of the forest's transformation became apparent. The crystal's energy had spread through the natural network of roots and minerals, creating a kind of organic defense system. Any remaining pieces of Dr. Hale's technology were being systematically altered, their artificial controls replaced by natural processes. "It's beautiful," Maggie said softly, watching the morning light play through the trees. The forest she'd chosen for her retirement had revealed itself to be far more extraordinary than she'd ever imagined. The forest wasn't just protecting itself, it was evolving, becoming stronger. Ethan continued documenting everything with his camera, capturing the way the transformed equipment now pulsed in harmony with the forest's natural rhythms. "The crystal's energy signature is unique," he explained, reviewing his measurements. "It's not just blocking artificial signals, it's creating a new kind of communication network, one that works with nature instead of against it." The sound of distant helicopters had ceased completely. Dr. Hale's operation had abandoned their attempt to control these mountains, leaving behind only transformed remnants of their technology. The forest had not only resisted their interference, but had emerged stronger, more resilient. "We should check the underground facility one last time," Maggie suggested, her teacher's thoroughness coming through. They made their way back to the hidden entrance, finding it already being reclaimed by nature. Vines and roots had begun growing through the abandoned equipment, guided by the crystal's influence. Inside, the sophisticated monitoring systems lay dark and silent, their purposes transformed by the same force that had liberated the wildlife. The screens that had once displayed tracking data now reflected only the natural light filtering through the entrance. The forest had rendered the entire control center obsolete. The bear watched from nearby as they emerged from the facility, its presence a reminder of how this had all begun. The electronic collar around its neck, once a tool of control, now served only as a testament to nature's victory over artificial dominance. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, looking around at the transformed forest. The crystal's energy had created something entirely new, a natural defense system that would prevent any future attempts to control this ecosystem. Maggie smiled, her teacher's wisdom showing in her expression. "Now we make sure this story gets told," she said. "Not just about what they tried to do here, but about how nature found a way to protect itself. There are lessons here that need to be shared." In the weeks that followed, Maggie's mountain home became a testament to nature's resilience. The forest had not only survived Dr. Hale's attempts to control it, but had emerged transformed, protected by the crystal's extraordinary energy. The sophisticated technology that had once threatened to dominate these mountains now lay transformed, integrated into the natural world in ways its creators had never intended. "The transformation is still spreading," Ethan reported, reviewing his latest measurements. He had stayed on, helping Maggie document the forest's remarkable evolution. The crystal's energy had created a natural defense network throughout the mountains, turning any remaining artificial control systems into conduits for its protective force. The bears, now completely free from electronic control, had established new patterns of behavior that reflected their natural instincts. The electronic collars remained as silent reminders of what had transpired, but the animals showed no lingering effects from their time under artificial control. Nature had healed itself. "Look at this," Maggie called from her garden one morning. The experimental device they'd found in the metal box had undergone a final transformation. Its electronic components had been completely restructured by the crystal's energy, turning it into something that pulsed in harmony with the forest's natural rhythms. Their documentation of events had grown extensive. Ethan's technical knowledge, combined with Maggie's scientific observations, created a detailed record of how nature had defended itself against artificial control. The evidence they'd saved from the ransacked cabin proved crucial in understanding what had happened in these mountains. The underground facility had been completely reclaimed by the forest. Roots and vines grew through abandoned equipment, transforming the space into a natural grotto. The sophisticated monitoring systems that had once tracked every movement in the forest now served as anchors for new growth, their purposes fundamentally altered by the crystal's influence. "It's like the forest created its own immune system," Maggie observed, watching new crystal formations emerge in unexpected places. Her teacher's mind had helped her understand that they weren't just witnessing the aftermath of events. They were seeing the beginning of something entirely new. The bear that had first led them to discover the truth now visited regularly, often bringing others with it. The animals moved freely through their restored habitat, their natural bonds strengthened by their shared experience. The electronic collars they still wore had become symbols of resistance rather than control. Ethan's research had revealed something remarkable about the crystal's energy. "It's not just protecting this forest," he explained, showing Maggie his latest findings. "It's creating a template that could help other natural systems defend themselves. The transformation we witnessed here could spread, helping nature resist artificial control wherever it's threatened." As autumn turned to winter, Maggie's cabin became a center for studying how nature had overcome attempts to control it. The crystal's energy continued to pulse through the forest, maintaining its protective influence over the mountains. Dr. Hale's ambitious project had unintentionally revealed something far more powerful than any artificial control system: nature's ability to adapt and defend itself. "We need to share what we've learned," Maggie said one evening, reviewing their extensive documentation. "Not just about the technology they tried to use here, but about how the forest found a way to protect itself. There are lessons here that could change how people think about their relationship with nature." The transformed devices scattered throughout the forest had become part of a new kind of network, one that worked in harmony with natural processes instead of trying to control them. The crystal's energy had shown that true power lay not in domination, but in cooperation with nature's inherent wisdom. As snow began to fall on the mountains, Maggie stood on her porch, watching the forest she'd grown to understand in entirely new ways. The peaceful retirement she'd planned had become something far more significant, a front-row seat to nature's remarkable demonstration of resilience and adaptation. The bear appeared one last time at the edge of the clearing, its presence a reminder of how their extraordinary journey had begun. The electronic collar around its neck, now permanently silent, gleamed in the winter light, a symbol of how nature had transformed an instrument of control into a testament of freedom. "The story isn't over," Ethan said, standing beside Maggie as they watched the bear disappear into the snowy forest. "What happened here will have ripple effects we can't even imagine yet." The crystal's energy continued to pulse through the mountains, a guardian force ensuring that this piece of wilderness would remain forever free from artificial control. Dear listeners, we hope you've been captivated by Maggie and Ethan's extraordinary journey through the Crystal Forest. Their story reminds us of nature's incredible power to protect and heal itself. If you've enjoyed this tale of discovery and natural wonder, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the mysteries of our world. Join our community in the comments below and share your thoughts about this remarkable adventure. Don't forget to click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest stories. Together, we can continue to uncover and share the extraordinary tales that remind us of the magic that exists in our world.